The sound of a rifle salute cracks through the morning air at Arlington National Cemetery, where white headstones stretch endlessly beneath a pale autumn sky. Among the mourners stands a solitary figure, back straight medals gleaming on his dress uniform, weathered hands steady at his sides. 70 years of living as a black man in America. 40 years serving a country that still sees his skin before his service. A gun is drawn, commands are shouted, hands rise slowly against the backdrop of a flag-draped coffin. Dignity has a cost. Silence has consequences. And some battles don't end when the war is over. They simply follow soldiers home. In the shadow of monuments built to honor fallen heroes, a different kind of courage is required. Not the courage to charge into gunfire, but the courage to stand unwavering when the system designed to protect turns its weapons on you. Some fights aren't chosen. Some moments demand witness. And sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply to remain standing. The morning light filtered through a thin layer of October clouds, casting Arlington National Cemetery in a pale, reverent glow. Thousands of white headstones stretched across the rolling hills, each one a silent testament to sacrifice. Among them walked William Anderson, his back ramrod straight despite his 67 years. The medals on his dress uniform caught occasional glints of sunlight, not that he noticed. His weathered hands, strong hands that had once commanded battalions in the blood-soaked streets of Mosul, now hung loosely at his sides. Next to him, Sarah Anderson maintained a respectful silence. At 32, she was the image of her grandmother William's late wife, with the same questioning eyes that seemed to search for truths beyond what was visible. Her heels sank slightly into the soft grass as they made their way toward a small gathering in the distance. "Are you sure about this, Uncle Will?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's waiting for you there except silence?" William's pace never faltered. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where a group of people had begun to assemble around a flag-draped coffin. "It's precisely because of the silence that I need to be present," he replied, each word measured and heavy with purpose. Sarah glanced at her uncle's profile, the strong jaw, the faint scar above his right eyebrow from shrapnel in his first tour, the eyes that had seen too much death to be truly surprised by anything anymore. She understood what he wasn't saying, that silence had been both weapon and shield throughout his career. That silence was what allowed injustice to flourish in the shadows. "James would have come for me," William added softly. The funeral service for Lieutenant Colonel James Matthews was scheduled for 11 a.m. Matthews, the last of William's squad from Iraq still living, had died of pancreatic cancer 3 days earlier. William had received the news via a brief phone call from Matthews' wife, Eleanor. Her voice had cracked only once during the conversation. "He always said you were the best of them, General." Now, as they approached the gathering, William noted the precise arrangement of the honor guard, the careful positioning of the chaplain, the small crowd of mostly white faces in dark suits and dresses. A perimeter had been established with understated security men in dark glasses standing at regular intervals, hands clasped before them, earpieces barely visible. "They're watching you," Sarah murmured. William gave a barely perceptible nod. "They always do." As they neared the assembly, a tall officer with captain's bars approached them. His face was professionally neutral, clipboard in hand. "Name, sir?" he asked, eyes flicking briefly to William's uniform. "General William Anderson, United States Army, retired." William replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of command despite its quiet delivery. The captain checked his list, nodded once, and stepped aside. "Thank you for your service, General. Mrs. Matthews mentioned you would be attending." William nodded his acknowledgement and guided Sarah forward. They found seats in the third row, directly behind a cluster of men, with military bearing Matthews' more recent colleagues, William surmised. Their hair was less gray, their shoulders still carrying the invisible weight of active service. The ceremony began with mechanical precision. The chaplain spoke of duty, honor, and sacrifice, words that had lost none of their meaning for William, despite how often they were cheapened in political speeches. A colonel who had served with Matthews in his later years delivered a brief eulogy, speaking of leadership and integrity. When it came time for the traditional rifle volley, William felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not from emotion, but from the deep-seated instinct that had kept him alive through 3 wars. The sharp crack of rifles still triggered something primal in him, something that would never fully fade. After the ceremony concluded, William rose slowly. He straightened his uniform jacket and squared his shoulders. I need to pay my respects, he told Sarah. Alone, if you don't mind. Sarah nodded, understanding. I'll wait here. William made his way forward as the crowd began to disperse. Eleanor Matthews stood beside the casket, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. When she saw William approaching, something changed in her expression, a softening, a recognition of shared history. William, she said simply, extending her hands. He took them in his own. Eleanor, I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner. You're here now, that's what matters. Her eyes, red-rimmed but dry, held his. He knew you would come. William nodded once. We made a promise long ago. In Mosul, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Eleanor squeezed his hands and released them. He left something for you. I'll have it sent to your home. William inclined his head in gratitude. Then as Eleanor moved away to speak with other mourners, he turned to face the flag-draped coffin. He stood at attention, his posture perfect despite the years and the old wounds that ached in cold weather. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand in a formal salute. Not the quick acknowledgement of a passing officer, but the sustained salute of profound respect. He held the position unmoving. In that moment, Robert Hayes noticed him. Hayes was the head of security for the funeral, a 45-year-old white police officer with a record that his superiors described as exemplary. 23 years on the force had taught him to spot anomalies, and something about the old black man in full-dress uniform triggered his suspicion. He had overseen the guest list personally. There were 3 generals expected to attend, and he had verified each one upon arrival. This man wasn't one of them. Hayes watched from 20 yards away as the old man maintained his salute. The crowd continued to thin around him, creating an unintentional circle of empty space. The black man's focus never wavered from the casket. Hayes touched the radio at his shoulder. Control, I have an unidentified individual at the Matthews service. Male, African-American, elderly, wearing what appears to be a general's uniform. The radio crackled. Is he causing a disturbance? Negative, but he's not on our verified list. There was a pause. Maintain visual. Approach if necessary. Hayes's hand dropped to his holster, a habitual gesture unconscious after decades on the force. He began moving toward the saluting figure, his stride purposeful. Sarah noticed first. From her position several yards away, she saw the security officer's approach, noted the hand hovering near his weapon. She started forward but found her path blocked by departing mourners. William remained motionless, his salute unwavering. In his mind, he was no longer at Arlington. He was back in the dust-filled streets of Mosul. Matthews beside him as they cleared a building after an IED had taken out the lead vehicle in their convoy. Matthews, then a young lieutenant, had saved 3 men that day, carrying each one through sniper fire to the relative safety of a collapsed wall. Sir, Hayes's voice cut through William's remembrance, sharp and authoritative. I need to see your identification. William held the salute for 1 more second, then lowered his arm with deliberate slowness. He turned to face Hayes, his expression calm. Of course, officer, he said, reaching slowly for his inside pocket. Hayes's hand moved to his holster, gripping the butt of his service weapon. Keep your hands where I can see them, he ordered, his voice rising. William froze, hands halfway to his jacket. Step back from the casket. Hayes continued scanning William's uniform with openly skeptical eyes. Who are you? How did you get past security? By now, several mourners had stopped to observe the confrontation. Sarah had pushed her way through the crowd and was approaching rapidly. My name is General William Anderson, United States Army, retired, William replied calmly. I served with Lieutenant Colonel Matthews in Iraq. Hayes's expression hardened. There's no General Anderson on today's approved list. I'm going to need you to come with me, sir. William nodded once. I'd be happy to clear up any confusion. May I show you my identification now? Hayes hesitated, then nodded tersely. Slowly, William reached into his jacket with careful, deliberate movements and extracted a small leather wallet. He opened it to reveal his military ID and extended it toward Hayes. Hayes studied it, his frown deepening. This could be fake. Anyone can get a uniform and medals these days. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Sarah had reached them now, her face tight with controlled anger. Officer, my uncle was invited personally by Mrs. Matthews. She said, her voice level despite her evident tension. Hayes ignored her, his focus entirely on William. I'm going to need you to come with me for verification, sir. William's expression remained impassive. Of course. It happened in an instant, a moment that would later be dissected frame by frame on news programs and social media. As William began to turn to accompany Hayes away from the gravesite, Hayes's hand moved to his weapon again. This time he drew it. Don't move. Hayes suddenly shouted, his service pistol now pointed directly at William's chest. Hands up now. The cemetery fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs. William slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, his movements calm and unhurried. His eyes never left Hayes's face. Officer, he said quietly, I am not a threat to you or anyone else here. Hayes's hands had a barely perceptible tremor, the barrel of his gun wavering slightly. Shut up! You don't belong here! The crowd had fallen back, gasps and murmured exclamations rippling through the assembled mourners. Phones had appeared recording the confrontation. Sarah stood frozen, her face a mask of horror and fury. I said hands up! Hayes repeated, his voice cracking slightly. William's hands were already raised, steady and dignified. My hands are up, officer, he replied, his voice carrying across the now silent cemetery. I am complying with your instructions. From the edge of the crowd, a woman in an army dress uniform stepped forward. Colonel Julia Reynolds, her insignia indicated a white woman in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair. Officer, she said, her tone carrying the unmistakable weight of command, lower your weapon immediately. Hayes didn't look at her, his gun still trained on William. Ma'am, please step back. This is a security matter. That man, Colonel Reynolds continued, her voice rising, is General William Anderson, former commander of the 3rd Infantry Division and recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. I served under his command in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Lower your weapon now. A ripple went through the gathered crowd. More phones appeared, recording the confrontation from multiple angles. Hayes's face flushed red, but his gun remained pointed at William's chest. I don't care if he's dressed like a general. I don't know him, and he's not on my list. I know. William remained perfectly still, his expression betraying nothing. Decades of combat had taught him to control his breathing, to project calm in the face of chaos. But Sarah could see the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, not fear, but a deep, resigned recognition. Officer Hayes, came another voice, Eleanor Matthews stepping forward from the crowd. This man was my husband's commanding officer and friend. He is here at my invitation. Hayes's eyes darted between Eleanor and William, confusion, and something darker flashing across his features. Ma'am, with all due respect, we have protocols. Lower your weapon, Colonel Reynolds repeated, her voice now ice. That's an order, officer. Hayes's grip on his pistol tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. I don't take orders from a woman, Reynolds cut in, or from someone defending a black man in uniform. The cemetery had gone deathly quiet. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed muted. Williams spoke, then his voice steady and clear. Officer Hayes, I understand you're doing your job. I respect that, but I am unarmed and not resisting. There's no need for weapons here among the fallen. Something in Williams' quiet dignity seemed to inflame Hayes further. His face contorted with sudden rage. I don't bow down to some old man playing dress-up soldier. He spat the gun, shaking visibly now in his grip. I don't care what medals you're wearing. Robert, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Another police officer, younger white, his name tag reading Taylor, had pushed through the crowd. What the hell are you doing? Put the gun down. Hayes didn't move, his eyes locked with Williams. He's not on the list, Hayes repeated, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Officer Taylor moved carefully to Hayes' side. Robert, there are 30 people filming this right now. Think about what you're doing. For 3 eternal seconds, the outcome hung in the balance. Williams stood unmoving, hands raised, face composed. Hayes trembled, fingers still on the trigger, caught in the grip of something beyond mere suspicion. Then slowly, Hayes lowered his weapon. As he did, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the crowd. Officer Taylor moved forward, placing himself between Hayes and William. Sir, Taylor addressed William, I apologize for this incident. Please, may I see your identification? William slowly reached into his jacket and produced his military ID again. Taylor examined it briefly and handed it back with a respectful nod. "Thank you, General Anderson. Again, my sincere apologies." William lowered his hands at last. "No apology necessary, officer. You were not the one who drew a weapon at a funeral." Taylor turned to Hayes, who stood rigid, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Robert, I think you should return to the command post." Hayes's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then without a word, he holstered his weapon and stalked away, shouldering roughly through the crowd. As he departed, the spell of silence broke. The crowd erupted in murmured conversations, phones still recording. Sarah rushed to William's side, taking his arm. "Uncle Will, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with constrained fury. William placed his hand over hers. "I'm fine, Sarah." Colonel Reynolds approached them, her face grim. "General Anderson, I can't express how—" "Please," William interrupted gently. "No apologies necessary. What's done is done." Eleanor Matthews had moved to stand beside them, her face pale but composed. "William, I'm so sorry this happened here of all places." William turned to face the flag-draped coffin once more. "James would have found it grimly appropriate," he said, a hint of somber humor touching his voice for the first time. "He always said our battles wouldn't end when we left the service." Reynolds nodded solemnly. "He was right about that, sir." William squared his shoulders and once again raised his hand in a formal salute to his fallen comrade. This time Reynolds joined him, as did several other military personnel in the crowd. They held the position in unified silence, a wall of respect around Matthew's final resting place. When William finally lowered his hand, he turned to Sarah. "I think we should go now." As they walked away from the gravesite, William maintained his dignified bearing. But Sarah felt the slight tremor in his arm, not fear, but a deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "They never let you just be a soldier, do they?" she asked quietly. William's gaze remained forward, fixed on the distant gates of Arlington. "No," he said simply. "They don't." By nightfall, the video had gone viral. Shot from multiple angles, the footage showed with perfect clarity the moment when Hayes drew his weapon on a decorated general paying respects to a fallen comrade. The images were damning in their simplicity: an elderly black man in full-dress uniform, hands, raised face composed, staring down the barrel of a gun, while standing beside a flag-draped coffin. In William's modest home in Alexandria, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Sarah had taken to answering it, fielding calls from journalists, military associates, and strangers, expressing outrage or support. William sat in his study, the lights dimmed, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk before him. On the television in the corner, muted news channels cycled through the footage on endless repeat. William watched without expression as his own face appeared again and again on the screen, frozen in that moment of dignity under threat. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he said. Sarah entered, a tablet in her hand. "CNN wants an interview. So does MSNBC, Fox, and every other network. The Pentagon has issued a statement condemning the incident. And—" she hesitated. "And," William prompted, "your old unit from Mosul has started a hashtag, we stand with General. It's trending nationwide." William nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "Turn them all down," politely. Sarah sat in the chair across from him. "Uncle Will, this is big. Really big. People are listening now." William finally reached for the bourbon, taking a small sip. The amber liquid burned pleasantly, a familiar sensation in a day that had spun rapidly beyond his control. "I didn't go there to make a statement, Sarah. I went to say goodbye to a friend." "I know, that's why it's so powerful." Sarah set the tablet down, the screen still illuminated with notifications. "You weren't trying to be a symbol. You were just being yourself, a general paying respects. And they still pulled a gun on you." William studied his niece's face, the passionate conviction in her eyes so reminiscent of her mother, his sister who had marched in Selma and taught her children that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Speak," Sarah answered immediately. "Just speak the truth. Your truth. People will listen now." William set down his glass. "The truth?" he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "The truth is that what happened today happens every day in 1,000 different ways to people who don't have cameras recording, who don't have medals on their chests, who don't have colonels stepping forward to defend them. Sarah leaned forward. Exactly. That's why your voice matters, because for once everyone saw it happen to someone they couldn't dismiss. Before William could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, his expression shifting subtly. Who is it? Sarah asked. Officer Taylor, William replied, scanning the message. The young officer who intervened today, he wants to meet. Sarah's eyes widened. Why? William set the phone down. He says he has information about Hayes and about the department. He looked up at his niece. He says it's not an isolated incident. Of course it's not, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Are you going to meet him? William was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the muted television where his own face stared back at him from the screen. Yes, he finally said. Tomorrow morning. Sarah studied her uncle's face. You're not surprised by any of this, are you? William's expression remained impassive, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen wars and revolutions, triumph and atrocity, held a depth of weariness that transcended mere fatigue. No, he said quietly. I'm not surprised. Disappointed, perhaps, but not surprised. Sarah reached across the desk and took his hand, the hand that had once directed battalions, that had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, that had held her when she was a child and afraid of thunderstorms. Then use that, she urged gently. Use that knowledge. Make them see what you've always seen. William looked down at their joined hands, her smooth brown skin against his weathered palm. In that moment he saw not just his niece, but generations stretching behind and ahead, his grandparents who had endured Jim Crow, his parents who had fought for civil rights, his own children and their children who still faced battles he had hoped would be long resolved by now. All right, he said finally. I'll speak, but on my terms. Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. I wouldn't expect anything else. As she left the room, William turned his attention back to the silent television. The footage had changed, now showing Hayes being escorted from Arlington by his fellow officers, his face a mask of defensive anger. William studied him with the detached analysis of a career soldier, the rigid posture, the barely controlled rage, the reflexive reach for authority when challenged. William recognized the type. He had seen it in every conflict zone he'd ever served, in men who confused power with strength, who mistook domination for respect. Such men were dangerous not because they were monsters, but because they believed absolutely in their own righteousness. He switched off the television and turned to the window instead. Outside, the streets of Alexandria were quiet, the autumn night settling over the colonial buildings with familiar grace. Somewhere out there, Officer Robert Hayes was likely watching the same footage, seeing his career and reputation disintegrate in real time. William felt no satisfaction in that thought, only a bone-deep weariness and the grim certainty that tomorrow would bring new battles on unfamiliar terrain. His phone buzzed again, another text, this one from an unknown number. General Anderson, my name is Carla Jenkins, Lieutenant, with Metro PD. I worked with Hayes for 3 years. What happened today wasn't the first time. I have documentation. Can we meet? William stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple reply. Yes, my home, tomorrow. 3 p.m. He set the phone down and picked up the framed photograph on his desk, himself and Matthews, in Mosul, arms around each other's shoulders, covered in dust, but smiling through their exhaustion after a successful mission. Well, old friend, he murmured to the image. It seems our last battle will be fought after all. Outside, a light rain began to fall, washing the autumn leaves from the sidewalks and turning the streetlights into hazy constellations. William sat in the darkened study, listening to the gentle rhythm on the roof, preparing himself for what was to come. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the same steady resolve that had carried him through 3 wars and countless battles. This time the battlefield was home. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of soft Virginia rain that seemed to blur the edges of the world. William rose at 0500 hours, his body still adhering to the military schedule, ingrained over decades of service. He dressed in civilian clothes, pressed slacks, a blue button-down shirt, polished shoes, and made coffee in the kitchen, while the house remained silent around him. Officer Taylor had arranged to meet him at a small cafe 3 blocks from William's home. At precisely 0700, William left the house, declining Sarah's offer to accompany him. Some conversations need to happen between soldiers, he told her gently. The cafe was nearly empty when William arrived, just a few early morning customers hunched over laptops or newspapers. He spotted Officer Taylor immediately. The young man sat in the corner in civilian clothes, his posture betraying his nervousness even from across the room. William approached with unhurried steps. Taylor looked up, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. "General Anderson," he said, rising quickly. "Thank you for coming." William gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Taylor," he acknowledged, taking the seat opposite. "Or do you prefer Officer?" Taylor grimaced slightly. "Just Michael is fine, sir." He hesitated, "especially given what I'm about to tell you." A waitress approached and William ordered black coffee. When she had gone, he turned his full attention to Taylor. "You said you had information about Officer Hayes." Taylor nodded, glancing around the cafe before leaning forward. "Yes, sir, but it's not just about Hayes. It's about the whole system." William's expression remained neutral. "I'm listening." Taylor took a deep breath. "I've been on the force for 3 years. Hayes has been my superior for most of that time. What happened yesterday at Arlington?" He paused, swallowing hard. "It wasn't an isolated incident." "I assumed as much," William replied evenly. Taylor reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim flash drive, placing it on the table between them. "There have been 17 complaints filed against Hayes in the past 5 years, all of them from Black or Latino civilians, all of them dismissed for lack of evidence or conflicting testimony." William glanced at the flash drive but made no move to take it. "And you have access to these files because—" "I'm in internal affairs," Taylor admitted. "Or I was until this morning." William's eyebrows rose slightly. "Was—" Taylor's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "I've been temporarily reassigned, pending an investigation into my breach of protocol yesterday. Apparently contradicting a superior officer in public is a more serious offense than drawing a weapon on a decorated general." The waitress returned with William's coffee. He thanked her and took a careful sip before responding. "Why are you telling me this, Mr. Taylor? Why now?" Taylor met his gaze directly for the first time. "Because I've been quiet too long, sir. I've seen the reports. I've watched evidence disappear. I've heard the jokes in the locker room. And I've told myself that I was different, that by staying silent, I could somehow change things from the inside." He shook his head. "Yesterday showed me how hollow that reasoning was." William studied the young man's face, the earnest blue eyes, the tension around his mouth, the faint shadows beneath his eyes suggesting a sleepless night. "You understand what you're doing?" William said. It wasn't a question. Taylor nodded once. "Yes, sir, I do." "Your career is less important than doing what's right," Taylor finished firmly. William took another sip of his coffee, considering. "There will be consequences, not just professional ones." Taylor's jaw tightened. "I know. My father was a cop. So was his father. The thin blue line runs deep in my family." His voice dropped slightly. "They're not speaking to me this morning." William nodded slowly, acknowledging the sacrifice. "What exactly is on this drive, Mr. Taylor?" "Everything," Taylor replied. "Complaint reports, internal memos about handling certain demographics, body cam footage that never made it to court, including," he hesitated briefly, "footage of Hayes from 6 different incidents involving excessive force against minorities, incidents that were ruled justified in official reports." William's eyes narrowed slightly. "And how did these incidents remain justified despite such evidence?" Taylor's expression darkened. "That's the worst part, sir. The system worked exactly as designed. The footage was reviewed. The incidents were investigated. And in each case, Hayes's actions were found to be consistent with department policy and training." "I see," William said quietly. "No, sir," Taylor said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "That's just it. I don't think you do see. Because the problem isn't just Hayes. It's not even just my department. The problem is that everything Hayes did was technically within policy. The problem is that the entire system is built to justify exactly the kind of behavior you experienced yesterday." William was silent for a long moment, his coffee cooling untouched before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. When I was in command in Iraq, we had protocols for everything. Rules of engagement, escalation procedures, chain of command. These structures exist for a reason: to provide clarity in chaos, to ensure consistent response, to maintain discipline. He paused. But I learned very quickly that systems are only as good as the values they serve. A perfect system serving a flawed purpose will produce perfect harm. Taylor nodded slowly. That's exactly it, sir. William reached for the flash drive, finally taking it from the table. Thank you for your courage, Mr. Taylor. Taylor's expression was a mixture of relief and apprehension. What will you do with it? William pocketed the drive. I haven't decided yet, but I promise you this: I won't let your risk be for nothing. As they prepared to leave, Taylor hesitated. Sir, there's one more thing you should know. William paused, waiting. There's a lieutenant named Carla Jenkins, Taylor said. She worked with Hayes for years. She filed 4 separate internal reports about his behavior. After the 4th, she was transferred to night patrol in the Southeast District. She knows more than I do. William nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Thank you for the information. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming steadily on the cafe awning. William opened his umbrella, offering to share it with Taylor, who declined with a shake of his head. I don't mind the rain, the young officer said, turning up his collar against the weather. William studied him one last time. Why did you really step forward yesterday, Mr. Taylor? The truth. Taylor looked away, watching the rain create ripples in the gathering puddles. My grandfather fought in Vietnam, he said finally. He was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne. He came home with 2 Purple Hearts and stories he would only tell after his 3rd whiskey. Taylor met William's eyes again. He taught me that real respect isn't about uniform or rank or race. It's about recognizing the humanity in another person. He extended his hand. When I saw Hayes pull that gun on you, sir, I didn't see a black man and a white officer. I saw my grandfather being disrespected on a sacred ground. William took the offered hand, his grip firm. Your grandfather raised a good man, Mr. Taylor. They parted ways in the rain, Taylor heading toward his car, shoulders hunched against the downpour. William walking steadily back toward his home umbrella, held high the flash drive, a weighted presence in his pocket. The world had changed since yesterday. William could feel it in the glances from passers-by who recognized him from the news, in the sudden hush that fell over the corner store when he entered to buy a newspaper, in the respectful nod from the mail carrier who had never acknowledged him before. Fame, William knew from experience, was a double-edged sword. It created opportunity, but also exposed vulnerabilities. He had never sought the spotlight, preferring to lead from within rather than above. But sometimes circumstances chose the battlefield for you. As he approached his home, William saw a news van parked across the street, a reporter standing under an umbrella, clearly waiting. He sighed inwardly but maintained his steady pace. The reporter spotted him and hurried over, cameraman in tow. General Anderson, Jennifer Wells, Channel 7 News. Could we have a moment of your time? William stopped, straightening to his full height. Ms. Wells, I'm not giving interviews at this time. The reporter pressed on. Sir, the video of yesterday's incident has been viewed over 10 million times. People want to hear your perspective. How did it feel to have a gun drawn on you while paying respects to a fallen comrade? William regarded her calmly. Ms. Wells, with all due respect, what happened to me yesterday happens to countless citizens every day. The only difference is that I was wearing medals that made some people pay attention. The reporter's expression shifted slightly, professional persistence giving way to genuine curiosity. Are you saying this is a systemic issue? William's gaze was steady. I'm saying that what happened at Arlington wasn't about me. It was about a mindset that sees threat where there is none, that reaches for weapons instead of words, that forgets we are all in the end serving the same flag. Would you call it racism? The reporter pressed. William was silent for a moment, raindrops pattering on his umbrella. I would call it a failure of our highest ideals, he finally said, and a reminder that uniform, whether military or police, comes with responsibility as well as authority. Before the reporter could ask another question, William nodded politely and continued toward his home. Good day, Ms. Wells. Inside, Sarah was waiting, the television tuned to news coverage of the incident. She muted it as he entered. How did it go with Taylor? She asked. William removed his coat, hanging it carefully on the rack by the door. Illuminating, he replied, taking the flash drive from his pocket and placing it on the coffee table. He provided evidence of a pattern. Sarah eyed the drive. What kind of pattern? The kind that doesn't surprise either of us. William said, his voice even. Hayes has a history, and the department has a history of protecting that history. Sarah's expression hardened. So what now? William checked his watch. Now we wait for Lieutenant Jenkins. She'll be here at 1500 hours. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. William glanced at Sarah, then moved to answer it. A woman stood on the porch, African-American mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement despite her civilian clothes. Her expression was guarded, her posture tense. General Anderson, she said formally. I'm Lieutenant Carla Jenkins. I know I'm early, but I thought it better not to be seen entering your home later. William stepped aside to let her in. A wise precaution, Lieutenant. Please come in. As Jenkins entered, Sarah rose from the couch. William made the introductions. My niece, Sarah Anderson. Sarah, this is Lieutenant Jenkins. Jenkins nodded to Sarah, then turned back to William. I won't waste your time, General. I worked with Hayes for 3 years in the Northwest District. During that time, I filed 4 separate internal reports documenting his behavior toward minorities. Each report was more detailed than the last. Each included witness statements, locations, times, dates. William gestured for her to sit. And the outcome? Jenkins' smile was bitter. The first was lost in processing. The second received a formal acknowledgement, but no action. The third resulted in Hayes receiving additional training in community relations. And the fourth? She paused, her jaw tightening. After the fourth, I was informed that my perspective might benefit from a change of environment. I was transferred to night patrol in Southeast, the district with the highest crime rate and lowest department resources. Sarah's expression was thunderous. They punished you for reporting him. Jenkins shrugged, a gesture that contained years of resigned frustration. Not officially. On paper, it was a lateral reassignment. In reality, it was a message. William's face remained impassive, but his eyes had darkened. Do you have copies of these reports? Lieutenant Jenkins reached into her bag and withdrew a worn notebook. I have something better, she said, placing the notebook on the coffee table beside Taylor's flash drive. I kept a daily log. Every incident, every comment, every joke in the locker room. Names, dates, witnesses. 3 years' worth. William picked up the notebook, leafing through it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailed accounts of incidents, conversations transcribed, verbatim observations recorded with clinical detachment. It was the work of someone who understood evidence, who knew that someday these words might need to stand up in court. You knew this day would come, he said, looking up at Jenkins. She met his gaze squarely. I hoped it wouldn't take someone like you being held at gunpoint to make people listen. But yes, I knew. Sarah leaned forward. Lieutenant Jenkins, why are you coming forward now? You must know the risks. Jenkins was silent for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father was a cop, she finally said. 30 years on the force in Chicago. He believed in the badge, what it stood for, what it could be. He raised me to believe that law enforcement was a calling, not just a job. Her voice tightened. He died last year. At his funeral, his partner of 20 years told me something I'll never forget. He said, your dad was one of the good ones. He never saw color. She looked up, her eyes bright with controlled emotion. But that's just it. My father did see color. He saw it every day. He saw how it affected who got stopped, who got searched, who got believed. The difference was he also saw the person behind the color. He saw humanity first. William nodded slowly, understanding. When I saw that video from Arlington, Jenkins continued, I saw Hayes doing exactly what I documented for years, but I also saw you, General, standing there with dignity, refusing to be anything less than who you are. She straightened her shoulders. My silence won't protect Hayes anymore. Not after this. William closed the notebook and set it gently back on the table. Thank you, Lieutenant. Your courage will not be wasted. Jenkins' expression was somber. It's not courage, General. It's duty. The same duty that made you salute your fallen comrade regardless of the consequences. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the windows. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared purpose, of battles fought on different fronts, but in service to the same ideals. The doorbell rang again, startling them all. William rose to answer it, his movements deliberate. When he opened the door, he found himself facing a tall black man in his 50s wearing a police uniform with sergeant's stripes. The man's expression was a mixture of discomfort and resolve. "General Anderson," the man said formally. "I'm Sergeant Troy Bell, Metro PD. May I come in?" William studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Of course, Sergeant." As Bell entered, he spotted Jenkins sitting in the living room. His step faltered momentarily, surprise flashing across his features. "Lieutenant," he acknowledged stiffly. "Sergeant," Jenkins replied, her voice equally formal. William closed the door and turned to face Bell. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" Bell removed his cap, holding it before him like a shield. "Sir, I saw the footage from Arlington, and I heard that Lieutenant Jenkins had contacted you." He swallowed visibly. "There's something you need to know. About Hayes. About the department. About me." Jenkins' expression hardened. "Sergeant Bell assisted in clearing Hayes after my third report. He signed off on the finding of no policy violation." Bell's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "That's right, I did." Sarah looked between them, sensing the tension. "Perhaps I should give you privacy?" "No," Bell interrupted. "Please stay, Miss Anderson. What I have to say should be heard by as many people as possible." He turned back to William. "General, I've been on the force for 22 years. I'm one of 3 black sergeants in a department of over 700 officers. I got there by—" He hesitated, shame flickering across his features. "By not making waves. By being one of the good ones." William's expression remained neutral. "Go on, Sergeant." Bell took a deep breath. 6 years ago, Hayes was involved in an incident with a black teenager. The boy was walking home from basketball practice carrying his gym bag. Hayes stopped him, claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect. When the kid tried to show his school ID, Hayes thought he was reaching for a weapon. He drew his gun, forced the kid to the ground, handcuffed him. Jenkins watched Bell intently, her expression unreadable. "It turned out the kid was the son of a city councilman." Bell continued. "There was pressure to investigate. I was assigned to review the case." His voice dropped. "Hayes came to me afterward, said if I found against him, he'd make sure I was assigned to night patrol in the Southeast District, the same threat they later used on Jenkins. Said no one would trust a black cop who threw another officer under the bus." "And you complied?" William stated, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. Bell's posture sagged slightly. "Yes, sir. I wrote up the incident as procedure followed no violation. I justified it to myself. The kid wasn't hurt, just scared. No lasting harm done." His voice hardened. "But there was harm done. To that kid's trust in the system, to my own integrity, and to every person Hayes encountered afterward, emboldened by the knowledge that he was untouchable." "Why tell us this now, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. Bell met her gaze directly. "Because when I saw that video, a decorated general, a man who served this country with honor, being held at gunpoint over a grave, I realized something. I've been so focused on being seen as a good cop that I forgot to be a good man." He turned back to William. "I'm prepared to testify, sir, about this incident, about the department culture, about everything I've witnessed and participated in." William was silent for a long moment, studying Bell's face. Then he gestured to the couch. "Please sit down, Sergeant. I believe we have much to discuss." As Bell took a seat, the 4 of them formed an unlikely council: the retired general, the police lieutenant, the police sergeant, and the civilian niece. Outside, the rain continued its steady cadence, washing Arlington clean. Inside, in that modest living room in Alexandria, the foundations of something momentous were beginning to take shape. "So," William said quietly, looking at each of them in turn, "where do we begin?" Jenkins placed her hand on her notebook. "With the truth, General." "We begin with the truth." William nodded, his expression solemn but resolute. "The truth, then, no matter where it leads us." And in that moment, with the rain as witness, they began to map the battlefield of their final, most important campaign, not against a foreign enemy, but against an enemy within. An enemy that had festered in silence for far too long. The battle for unwavering honor had truly begun. I've written the first part of your story, Unwavering Honor, 6,000 words following your outline and instructions. The narrative establishes the central confrontation at Arlington National Cemetery, where William Anderson faces discrimination while honoring his fallen comrade. I've maintained the cinematic writing style with strong imagery, emotional depth, and carefully paced dialogue. The video spread like wildfire through social media news outlets and messaging platforms. What had begun as shaky footage captured on a mourner's phone had transformed into a national conversation within 48 hours. William Anderson's face, dignified, composed hands raised before a flag-draped coffin, became the symbol of a struggle that had persisted for generations. In William's living room, the television played footage of protests forming outside police headquarters. Signs bearing his image and phrases like, "Respect our veterans," and "If he's not safe, who is?" waved above the crowds. William watched impassively, his hands folded in his lap, as commentators dissected every second of the Arlington confrontation. "Turn it off," he finally said to Sarah, who immediately muted the television. "It's not going away, Uncle Will," she said gently. "People are angry, and for once they're angry on our behalf." William rose from his chair and moved to the window. Outside, 3 more news vans had joined the first reporters, standing in the light rain, waiting for a statement. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. Sarah joined him at the window. "No one ever asked to become a symbol, but sometimes history chooses you." William turned to face her, his expression somber. "Your mother used to say something similar." "She was right." Sarah placed her hand on his arm. "And you know what else she would say, that staying silent now would be a betrayal of everything you fought for." Before William could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. "General Anderson," he answered, his voice steady. "General, this is Congressman Davis," came the reply. "I'm sure you're aware that the House Oversight Committee has launched an investigation into systemic issues within the Metro Police Department following your incident at Arlington." William's expression remained neutral. "I was not aware, Congressman." "Yes, well, it's moving rather quickly. We'd like you to testify. Your perspective as both a military leader and the victim in this situation would be invaluable." William caught Sarah's questioning look and put the phone on speaker. "I'm not a victim, Congressman," he replied evenly, "and I'm not interested in being a political prop." There was a brief pause on the line. "With all due respect, General, this isn't about politics. It's about accountability. Officer Hayes has been suspended pending investigation, but you and I both know this goes deeper than one officer with a temper." William exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "When would this testimony take place?" William asked. "Next Tuesday, 10 a.m. The committee will hear from department leadership first, followed by witnesses and affected community members." The congressman paused. "Your voice would carry significant weight, General." William considered for a moment. "I'll be there, Congressman, but on one condition." "Name it." "Lieutenant Carla Jenkins and Sergeant Troy Bell must also be invited to testify." There was another pause. "The police officers who've come forward with allegations about departmental culture?" "Yes," William confirmed. "If you want the full truth, you need their perspectives as well as mine." "I'll see to it personally," the congressman assured him. "And General, thank you for your continued service to this country." After William ended the call, Sarah studied him with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you sure about this, Uncle Will? Once you testify publicly, there's no going back." William's gaze was steady. There was no going back the moment Hayes drew his weapon at Arlington. The only question now is whether we move forward with purpose or let others control the narrative. Sarah nodded slowly. "What about Jenkins and Bell? Have you told them?" "Not yet," William replied, reaching for his phone. "But they need to be prepared. This battle is about to expand beyond anything they anticipated." Economy. The next morning brought unexpected news. As William sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the documentation provided by Jenkins and Bell, Sarah burst in her expression a mixture of disbelief and vindication. "Uncle Will, you need to see this." She placed her tablet before him, displaying a news article with the headline, "Exclusive Internal Police Email Reveals Racial Profiling Policy." William quickly scanned the article. An email from 2015 had been leaked to the press, a departmental communication from a training officer to new recruits. If you're uncertain, verify. If it's a white civilian, ask. If it's a person of color, detain. It's safer for you that way. Williams' expression darkened as he continued reading. The article included statements from anonymous officers confirming that such guidance, while rarely put in writing, was commonly expressed during training and reinforced through departmental culture. "Where did this come from?" William asked, looking up at Sarah. "No one knows. Anonymous source." Sarah took back the tablet. "But it validates everything Jenkins and Bell have been saying." William nodded slowly. "This changes the battlefield. The department can no longer claim these are isolated incidents or the actions of a few bad apples." "That's exactly what they're trying to do," Sarah replied, scrolling through the article. "Look, the police chief has already issued a statement calling the email inconsistent with department values and claiming it represents the unauthorized views of a single former employee." William's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Jenkins. "Have you seen the news? This is bigger than Hayes now. The whole system is exposed." As William composed a reply, the doorbell rang. Sarah went to answer it, returning moments later with Officer Taylor, his expression grim. "General Anderson," Taylor said, his voice tight. "I apologize for coming unannounced, but I thought you should hear this from me directly." "Now, Sheridan." William gestured for him to sit. "What's happened?" Taylor remained standing, his posture rigid with tension. "The department has identified the source of the leaked email, an officer in records management named Karen Williams. She's been suspended pending investigation for unauthorized access and distribution of confidential materials." Sarah's expression hardened. "They're punishing the whistleblower instead of addressing the content of the email." Taylor nodded grimly. "It gets worse. They're building a case that she manipulated the email, that the original contained no racial language, and she altered it before leaking it." William's eyes narrowed. "Can they prove that?" "They don't have to," Taylor replied bitterly. "Just suggesting it creates doubt, and doubt is all they need to muddy the waters." William was silent for a moment, considering. "Do you know this Officer Williams?" Taylor nodded. "Not well, but yes. She's been with the department for 12 years. Administrative role, clean record. African-American woman, mid-50s. And you believe the email is genuine?" Taylor met Williams' gaze directly. "I know it is, sir. I've seen similar communications during my time in internal affairs. They're usually more careful with their wording, but the intent is always clear." William rose from his chair, decision made. "We need to meet with her, before the department isolates her completely." Taylor looked uncertain. "Sir, that might not be possible. She's been placed on administrative leave in order to have no contact with other officers or the media." "I'm not an officer or the media," William replied evenly. "I'm a private citizen concerned about justice. Call her. Tell her I'd like to speak with her." As Taylor stepped outside to make the call, Sarah turned to William. "What are you thinking, Uncle Will?" William's expression was resolute. "I'm thinking that Officer Williams has just become a critical ally in this battle, and that she needs to know she's not fighting alone." Taylor returned, his expression slightly more hopeful. "She's agreed to meet. Tonight, 8 p.m., a coffee shop in Anacostia, far from department headquarters." William nodded. "Good. Contact Jenkins and Bell as well. They should be there." "Why?" Taylor asked. "Because," William replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded battalions, "it's time to consolidate our forces." The coffee shop in Anacostia was small and dimly lit, tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store. By 7:45 p.m., William, Sarah Jenkins, and Bell had taken positions at a corner table away from the windows. Taylor arrived 5 minutes later, scanning the room carefully before joining them. "Williams is on her way," he reported in a low voice. "She's being careful, switching cars, taking indirect routes. She's convinced she's being followed." Jenkins nodded grimly. "She probably is. When I filed my reports on Hayes, I noticed unmarked cars outside my apartment for weeks afterward." At precisely 8 p.m., the door opened, and a woman entered, African-American, medium height, with close-cropped gray hair and the careful bearing of someone who had spent a career being watchful. Her eyes found William, immediately recognition flashing across her features. As she approached their table, William rose to greet her. "Officer Williams, thank you for coming." "General Anderson." She acknowledged, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not sure what I can offer, but I'm here. William gestured to the empty chair. Please join us. These are my associates, my niece Sarah, Lieutenant Jenkins, Sergeant Bell, and I believe you know Officer Taylor. Williams nodded to each in turn, her expression guarded. As she sat, William noted the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes continually moved to the door and windows, the hyper-vigilance of someone who felt hunted. I assume you know why we wanted to speak with you, William began. William's smile was tight and humorless. Because I committed career suicide by leaking that email. Because you chose truth over security, William corrected gently. A choice I respect deeply. William studied him for a moment, as if gauging his sincerity. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly. They're saying I fabricated it, that I'm trying to smear the department for personal reasons. Did you? William asked directly. No, Williams replied without hesitation. That email is exactly as it was written in 2015. I've kept a copy since the day it was sent, along with dozens of others just like it. I knew someday they'd be needed. Jenkins leaned forward. Why now, Karen? Why release it after all this time? William's eyes flickered to William. Because of what happened at Arlington. Because for once people were actually paying attention. Her voice tightened with controlled emotion. My son is 22. Every time he leaves the house, I worry. Not because he's a criminal, he's an engineering student at Howard, but because to some officers, all they'll see is a threat. She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. When I saw the general standing there, hands raised with Hayes pointing a gun at him at a funeral for God's sake, something broke inside me. If a decorated general isn't safe from this treatment, what chance does my boy have? A heavy silence fell over the table. William was the first to break it. The congressional hearing is scheduled for Tuesday, he said. Congressman Davis has agreed to include Jenkins and Bell as witnesses. I'd like you to join us as well. William stiffened. That's not possible. I'm under investigation. If I testify publicly, I'll be fired immediately. You'll be fired anyway, Bell pointed out quietly. We all know how this works. William's expression hardened. At least if I stay quiet, I might be able to preserve my pension. 20 years of service, I can't just throw that away. William regarded her with compassion. I understand the sacrifice you're contemplating. Truly I do. But consider this, what is that pension worth if purchased with silence in the face of injustice? Williams looked down at her hands, tension visible in every line of her body. It's easy for you to say, General. You've had your career. Your reputation is secure. Is it? William countered gently. I've spent my life serving a country that still sees my uniform before my skin and my skin before my service. Nothing about this is easy, for any of us. Taylor, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. If all of us testify together, they can't dismiss it as isolated complaints. It becomes a pattern, irrefutable evidence of systemic issues. Jenkins nodded in agreement. Strength in numbers, Karen, just like we learned in the academy. Williams looked between them, conflict clear in her expression. And if we do this, if we testify, what then? What actually changes? William leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. I can't promise that everything changes overnight. What I can promise is that the truth will be spoken on record before those with the power to enact change. And that once spoken, that truth cannot be unheard. Sarah, who had been observing silently, added, sometimes bearing witness is the most powerful act of resistance. Williams took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing in her eyes. All right, I'll testify. But I want to bring more than just that single email. I have files, hundreds of documents showing how the department has systematically protected officers who engage in discriminatory practices. William nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Bring everything you have. This isn't about exposing one officer or one incident anymore. This is about bringing light to a system that has operated in shadows for too long. As they prepared to leave, Williams reached out and grasped William's hand. My father served in Vietnam, she said quietly. He always told me that the hardest battles are the ones you fight at home. Williams' grip tightened briefly around hers. Your father was a wise man, Officer Williams. Could he, Karen? She corrected with the first genuine smile of the evening. I think we're past titles now, don't you, General? William, he replied with a small nod of acknowledgement. Outside, the night had deepened the streets of Anacostia quiet, except for the occasional passing car. As they prepared to go their separate ways, William addressed the group one final time. Tuesday will only be the beginning, he warned them. Once we start down this path, there will be resistance, fierce, organized, and determined. Are you all prepared for that? One by one, they nodded. Jenkins with professional resolve, Bell with grim determination, Williams with newfound purpose, Taylor with youthful conviction. Then we proceed, William concluded, together. The video had reached over 20 million views by Sunday morning. News outlets across the political spectrum had picked up the story, framing it according to their particular editorial slants. Some focused on the disrespect shown to a decorated veteran. Others emphasized the racial component. Still others questioned the systemic issues within law enforcement. What none could deny was the power of the image itself: an elderly black man in full dress uniform, hands raised, face composed with dignity, staring down the barrel of a service weapon beside a flag-draped coffin. By mid-afternoon, William's phone was ringing constantly. Former military colleagues, journalists, activists, politicians, all wanting a statement, an interview, a soundbite. William declined them all, focusing instead on preparing for Tuesday's hearing. Sarah found him in his study, meticulously reviewing Jenkins' notebook and the files Taylor and Williams had provided. "Uncle Wiltmar," she said from the doorway, "there's someone here to see you." William looked up, a question in his eyes. "It's James's wife, Eleanor Matthews." William set down the documents and rose immediately. "Show her in, please." Eleanor Matthews entered the study with the same quiet dignity she had shown at Arlington. Though only days had passed since her husband's funeral, she carried herself with composure, her grief evident only in the tightness around her eyes. "William," she greeted him, accepting his offered hand. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Never," he assured her. "Please sit down. Can I offer you some tea?" Eleanor shook her head, taking the offered seat. "I can't stay long. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I wanted you to know that James would be proud of what you're doing." William sat across from her, his expression softening. "I wish none of this had happened, especially at his service." Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. "James always said the battlefield follows soldiers home. He just never expected it to follow him to Arlington." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "He wanted you to have this. I was going to mail it, but after everything that's happened, I thought it should be delivered in person." William accepted the package, carefully unwrapping it, to reveal a worn leather-bound journal. The cover was faded, the edges frayed from years of handling. "His field journal," Eleanor explained. "From Mosul. He kept it all these years." William opened the journal with reverent hands. Inside, in Matthew's precise handwriting, were entries dating back to their first deployment together. Tactical assessments, personal reflections, accounts of battles won and lost, the unvarnished reality of war, recorded by a man who had lived it alongside him. "I don't understand," William said, looking up at Eleanor. "Why would he want me to have this?" Eleanor's expression was gentle. "Turn to the last entry." William flipped to the final written page, dated just 1 week before Matthew's death. "The cancer is winning this battle. The doctors give me weeks, not months. As I prepare for my final deployment, I find myself thinking of William more than anyone except Eleanor. He always understood that the hardest fight isn't against the enemy, it's against the part of yourself that wants to surrender to hatred or indifference. In Iraq, I watched him maintain his humanity in the most inhumane conditions. If anyone can fight the battle that's coming for this country, it's him. I've instructed Eleanor to give him this journal after I'm gone. William, if you're reading this, remember what you taught us all in Mosul. The uniform is not what makes the soldier, it's the heart beneath it. This country needs your heart now more than ever. Stand your ground, old friend, just as you did for us." William closed the journal slowly, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, his eyes held a depth of emotion that belied his composed features. "Thank you for bringing this, Eleanor." She nodded, rising to leave. "He believed in you, William. Even at the end, when the pain was worst, he would watch the news and say, 'This country needs men like Anderson. Men who remember what we're fighting for.'" As William walked her to the door, Eleanor paused one last time. "Will you be at the hearing on Tuesday?" "Yes," William confirmed. along with several officers who have come forward with evidence of systemic issues within the department. Eleanor's expression was solemn. Good. James would say it's about time. She squeezed his hand once more. Take care of yourself, William. The battles at home can be the most costly. After she left, William returned to his study Matthew's journal still in his hands. He sat at his desk, reopening it to read entries from their shared past. The words transported him back to the dust and danger of Iraq, to moments of terror and triumph, to the brotherhood forged in combat. Sarah found him there hours later, still reading Matthew's voice alive again in the pages before him. Are you okay, Uncle Will? She asked softly. William looked up, his eyes clear and focused. Yes, he said with quiet certainty. I'm ready now. Monday morning brought new developments. As William and Sarah prepared for a strategy meeting with Jenkins, Belle Williams and Taylor, the television in the kitchen, broadcast breaking news. In a surprising development, Metro Police Officer Robert Hayes has given an exclusive interview defending his actions at Arlington National Cemetery last week. Hayes, who has been suspended pending investigation, claims he was following departmental protocol when he confronted retired General William Anderson. William paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips, as Hayes' face appeared on screen. The officer looked stressed but defiant, his posture rigid as he addressed the camera. I was doing my job, protecting a solemn national ceremony. An unidentified individual in what appeared to be a general's uniform was not on my security list. In today's environment with threats against public gatherings, I acted according to my training. This isn't about race, it's about security. The interviewer, a sympathetic-looking man in his 50s, nodded understanding. So you're saying you would have responded the same way regardless of the individual's race? Absolutely, Hayes insisted. This is being twisted into something it's not. I respect our military. My own father served. But in my position, verification of identity is critical. Sarah muted the television, turning to William. He's trying to control the narrative before the hearing. William set down his coffee cup, his expression unchanged. It was to be expected. He's lying, Sarah said, anger evident in her voice. He didn't ask for verification. He drew his weapon immediately. Yes, William agreed calmly. And the video shows that clearly. Let him speak. Tomorrow the truth will have its day. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of their allies. As William went to answer it, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. General Anderson, this is Walter Matz, former Deputy Director of Internal Affairs for Metro PD. I retired last year after 30 years with the department. I need to speak with you before tomorrow's hearing. It's important. William hesitated, then replied, My home. 1 hour. When he opened the front door, Jenkins, Bell, Taylor, and Williams stood on his porch, their expressions a mixture of determination and apprehension. Good morning, William greeted them. We have much to discuss, and potentially a new ally. They gathered in William's living room, spreading their documents across the coffee table, a paper trail of injustice spanning years. For the next hour, they refined their strategy for the hearing, deciding the order of testimony, the key points each would emphasize, the evidence they would present. As they worked, William shared Matthew's journal entries about leadership and integrity in difficult circumstances, words written years ago but eerily applicable to their current battle. His perspective is valuable, Jenkins observed. He saw the same issues from a different angle. William nodded. James understood that systems reflect the values of those who build and maintain them. If the system produces injustice, it's because injustice has been normalized within it. Bell, who had been quiet for much of the meeting, finally spoke up. I've been part of that normalization. He admitted, his voice heavy with regret. For years I told myself I was making a difference from within, but the truth is I was just making it easier for the system to claim diversity while changing nothing. Williams reached over and placed her hand on Bell's arm. We all made compromises, Troy. What matters is that we're standing up now. The doorbell rang again. William excused himself and went to answer it. On his porch stood a white man in his 60s, hair silver at the temples, wearing an impeccable suit that couldn't quite disguise the slight stoop of his shoulders. His eyes were sharp but tired, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. General Anderson, the man said, extending his hand. Walter Matz, thank you for seeing me. William shook the offered hand. Mr. Matz, please come in." As Matz entered the living room, Bell and Jenkins stiffened visibly. William's expression hardened. "What is he doing here?" Jenkins asked, her voice cold. William remained calm. "Mr. Matz contacted me this morning. He has information relevant to tomorrow's hearing." Matz looked around the room, taking in the hostile expressions. "I understand your skepticism," he said quietly. "As Deputy Director of Internal Affairs, I reviewed many of your complaints, including yours, Lieutenant Jenkins, and yours, Sergeant Bell." "And dismissed them all," Jenkins replied sharply. Matz nodded, accepting the accusation. "Yes, I did." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. William gestured to an empty chair. "Why don't you tell us why you're here, Mr. Matz?" Matz sat down heavily, as if the weight of years had suddenly caught up to him. "I retired last year after 3 decades with the department. For the last 12 years, I oversaw internal affairs. During that time, I reviewed 23 complaints against Officer Hayes, 5 formal investigations. I read every word, studied every piece of evidence." He paused, his gaze moving from face to face around the room. "And I let them all go, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because Hayes' statistics were good. Low crime in his district, high arrest numbers, the kind of metrics that make department leadership happy." The admission hung in the air, stark and damning. "Why tell us this now?" Taylor asked, breaking the silence. Matz looked directly at William. "Because when I saw that video from Arlington, a decorated general being held at gunpoint while paying respects to a fallen soldier, I realized how far we've fallen, how far I've fallen." His voice cracked slightly. "I joined the force to protect and serve. Somewhere along the way, I started protecting statistics instead of people." Williams leaned forward, skepticism clear in her expression. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Matz?" "Testimony," he replied simply. "Tomorrow before Congress, I want to explain how the system works, how complaints are processed, how decisions are made, how good officers raising concerns are silenced, while problematic ones are protected." He turned to Jenkins. "I want to explain why your reports on Hayes were buried, why Officer Williams was passed over for promotion 3 times despite exemplary service." Bell's expression remained guarded. "And why should we trust you now?" Matz met his gaze directly. "You shouldn't. Trust is earned, and I haven't earned yours. But tomorrow isn't about trust, it's about truth. And the truth is, I was part of the problem. For years, I chose statistics over justice, quantifiable metrics over human dignity." He looked down at his hands. "I can't undo that, but I can stand up now and say it was wrong." Williams studied Matz carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands, not the nervousness of deception, but the vulnerability of painful honesty. "If you testify tomorrow," Williams said quietly, "there will be consequences. Your reputation, your pension, your legacy, all could be at risk." Matz nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "General Anderson, my legacy is already written in every complaint I dismissed, every officer I failed to discipline, every citizen whose trust in the system I helped erode. Tomorrow isn't about salvaging my reputation. It's about finally doing what I should have done years ago." William looked around the room, gauging the reactions of his allies. Jenkins remained skeptical, Bell thoughtful, Williams watchful, Taylor cautiously hopeful, Sarah analyzing. After a moment, William nodded decisively. "Very well, Mr. Matz. You'll testify tomorrow, after Lieutenant Jenkins and before Sergeant Bell." Matz released a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Thank you, General." As the meeting continued, integrating Matt's perspective into their strategy, the dynamics in the room gradually shifted. Initial hostility gave way to cautious collaboration, then to something approaching solidarity. They were an unlikely alliance. The retired general, the suspended officers, the former internal affairs director, the civilian niece, united not by background or position, but by a shared commitment to truth. By late afternoon, their strategy was set. They had organized their evidence, prepared their statements, anticipated potential challenges. As they prepared to depart, William addressed them one final time. "Tomorrow will be difficult," he warned them. "There will be those who seek to discredit you, to minimize your experiences, to protect the status quo. Remember why we're doing this. Not for retribution, not even for justice alone, but for a future where the uniform, whether military or police, represents the highest ideals of service, not the lowest impulses of fear. Jenkins nodded, her expression resolute. For the officers who come after us. For my son, Williams added quietly, and all the sons and daughters who deserve better. For those who have suffered in silence, Bell contributed, his voice gaining strength. For the truth that deserves to be heard, Taylor affirmed. Matt spoke last, his voice subdued but certain. For the system that can be better than what we've allowed it to become. William looked at each of them in turn, these warriors for a different kind of battle. Then we are agreed. Tomorrow we stand together. As they filed out, Sarah remained behind, watching William as he gathered the documents they had reviewed. You've built quite an alliance in just a few days, she observed. William smiled slightly. In combat, you learn quickly who will stand beside you when the bullets start flying. The same principle applies here. Sarah helped him organize the final papers. Hayes gave that interview today. The department is clearly preparing their defense. Are you ready for what they might throw at you tomorrow? William's expression grew serious. In Iraq, we had a saying, the enemy gets a vote. It meant that no matter how carefully you plan, the opposition will act according to their own strategy. You have to be prepared to adapt. And are you prepared? William picked up Matthew's journal, running his thumb along the worn leather cover. James once told me that the hardest part of leadership isn't making the right decision. It's living with the consequences of that decision, whatever they may be. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes clear and determined. Yes, I'm prepared, for whatever comes. As twilight settled over Alexandria, William stood at his study window watching as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow would bring a different kind of battle than any he had fought before, not with weapons and tactics, but with words and truths long suppressed. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the evidence of systemic failure and individual courage, William Anderson prepared himself for what might be the most important mission of his long career of service. Not on foreign soil, but here in the heart of the nation he had sworn to defend. The battlefield had expanded, the stakes had risen, and the time for silence had passed. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and crisp, the October air carrying the first hint of winter. William rose before dawn, his military habits persisting despite retirement. He dressed with the same precision he had brought to his uniform for decades. Dark suit, white shirt, muted tie. The only concession to his distinguished career was the small pin on his lapel, the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor. Sarah joined him for a silent breakfast, both of them aware of the gravity of the day ahead. As they prepared to leave, William received a text from Jenkins. We're all in position, ready when you are, General. The drive to Capitol Hill was quiet, the streets of early morning Washington sparsely populated. As they approached the Rayburn House office building, however, the scene changed dramatically. Crowds had gathered on the sidewalks, protesters with signs, journalists with cameras, ordinary citizens drawn by the significance of the day's proceedings. William noted the signs as they passed Justice for Anderson and Reform the System, and If a General Isn't Safe, Who Is? The message that had begun with a single confrontation at Arlington had expanded, taking on meanings and dimensions beyond one man's experience. Security was tight at the building entrance. William and Sarah were escorted through the crowds by congressional staff cameras flashing around them. Inside, the hallways were crowded with staff, media, and observers trying to secure seats for the hearing. In a small anteroom adjacent to the hearing chamber, William found his allies waiting: Jenkins, Bell, Williams, Taylor, and Matz. Their expressions reflected a mixture of nervousness and resolve. Everyone ready? William asked, his calm presence steadying the group. They nodded, some more confidently than others. Williams clutched a thick folder of documents. Bell repeatedly straightened his already immaculate tie. Taylor paced the small space. Jenkins remained still, her posture military straight. Matt sat slightly apart, hands clasped to hide their trembling. A staff member appeared at the door. General Anderson, the committee is ready for you. William turned to the group one last time. Remember, he said quietly, this isn't about any one of us. This is about truth that has been hidden too long. They filed into the hearing room, taking their places in the designated seating area. The room was packed, every seat filled, cameras positioned strategically, the members of the House Oversight Committee arranged behind their elevated desk at the front. Congressman Davis, a black man in his 50s with a distinguished bearing, called the hearing to order. Today, this committee begins its investigation into allegations of systemic bias within the Metropolitan Police Department, prompted by the disturbing incident at Arlington National Cemetery involving retired General William Anderson. The cameras pan to William, who sat impassive and dignified in the front row of witnesses. We will hear testimony from department leadership, from officers within the system, and from General Anderson himself. Our goal is not to vilify any individual or institution, but to understand how such an incident could occur and what systemic issues it may reveal. The first witnesses were from department leadership: the chief of police, the director of training, the current head of internal affairs. They spoke of policies and procedures, of training initiatives and diversity efforts. They expressed regret for the Arlington incident, while carefully framing it as an aberration, not a symptom. Officer Hayes acted outside of protocol, the chief insisted. His actions do not reflect our department's values or training. William listened without expression, noting the careful language, the emphasis on individual failure rather than systemic issues. When it was Jenkins' turn to testify, the tone of the hearing shifted dramatically. With military precision, she outlined her experiences, the 4 reports she had filed about Hayes, the lack of action, her subsequent transfer to a less desirable assignment. This was not about one officer, she stated firmly. This was about a culture that protects certain behaviors and punishes those who question them. Bell followed his testimony, more emotional, but equally damning. He described the pressure to conform, the subtle and not so subtle ways that officers who raised concerns were marginalized. I compromised my integrity to protect my position, he admitted, his voice thick with regret. I chose to be seen as a good cop rather than a good man. It's a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. Williams presented her evidence: next emails, memos, training materials that revealed a pattern of racial profiling embedded within departmental practices. Her testimony was meticulous, each document building upon the last to create an irrefutable record of systemic bias. These weren't just suggestions, she explained, holding up a training document. These were directives passed down through the ranks, shaping how officers approach their duties. When Matz took the stand, a hush fell over the room. As the former Deputy Director of Internal Affairs, his testimony carried particular weight. I reviewed 23 complaints against Officer Hayes during my tenure. He stated, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. 5 formal investigations. In each case, despite compelling evidence, I chose not to recommend disciplinary action. A committee member leaned forward. And why was that, Mr. Matz? Matz met the question directly. Because his numbers were good. Low crime in his district, high arrest rates, the metrics that mattered to leadership. He paused, his expression pained. I chose statistics over people. I chose numbers over justice. The room was silent as the weight of his admission settled over the proceedings. Would you say this was a systematic approach? Another committee member asked. Yes, Matz replied without hesitation. It wasn't about conscious racism, though, that existed too. It was about a system that valued certain outcomes over ethical means. We created a culture where officers knew that results mattered more than methods. And in that environment, bias flourished unchecked. Throughout these testimonies, William observed the reactions of the committee members, the department representatives, the media. He noted the shifting expressions, the whispered consultations, the growing recognition that what they were hearing was not a series of isolated incidents, but evidence of a pervasive pattern. When William was finally called to testify, the room fell completely silent. He rose and moved to the witness table with the same dignified bearing that had carried him through combat zones and command posts. As he took his seat, cameras flashed, capturing the image of the decorated general preparing to speak truth to power. General Anderson, Congressman Davis began, "Thank you for being here today. Could you please describe in your own words what occurred at Arlington National Cemetery last week?" William leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice clear and measured. I attended the funeral of Lieutenant Colonel James Matthews, with whom I served in Iraq. After the ceremony, I approached the casket to render a final salute. Officer Hayes approached me, questioned my presence, and ultimately drew his weapon and pointed it at my chest while I stood beside my friend's flag-draped coffin. And in your assessment, why did this occur? William was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. Officer Hayes saw a threat where none existed. He saw my skin before my uniform, my age before my rank, my presence, as an intrusion rather than a right. Would you characterize his actions as racist? William's response was measured. I would characterize his actions as the product of a system that has normalized suspicion based on race. Whether Officer Hayes holds conscious racial bias is less important than the fact that he acted according to training and culture that taught him to see certain individuals as inherently suspicious. Another committee member leaned forward. General Anderson, you had a distinguished military career commanding troops in multiple combat zones. How does this incident compare to the challenges you faced in service? William's expression remained composed, but his eyes held a depth of experience that commanded attention. In combat, the enemy is clearly defined. The threat is obvious. The mission is explicit. But the battle we're discussing today is more insidious because it occurs within institutions sworn to protect all citizens equally. It's a battle against assumptions so deeply embedded they become invisible to those who hold them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. In Mosul, I commanded a diverse battalion. We faced external threats together, united by common purpose, despite our differences. What I experienced at Arlington was something no military training prepared me for: the experience of being seen not as a veteran, not as a general, not even as a mourner, but primarily as a threat. Because of the color of my skin, Hannah. The testimony continued for nearly an hour, William responding to questions with the same calm authority that had characterized his military command. He neither raised his voice nor showed anger, but spoke with a clarity and purpose that gave his words particular power. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Congressman Davis asked a final question. General Anderson, based on what you've experienced and what you've heard today, what would you recommend as a path forward? William straightened in his chair, his gaze steady. No organization improves by denying its flaws. The first step must be acknowledgement, honest recognition that bias exists not just in individuals, but in systems. The second must be accountability, not just for Officer Hayes, but for the culture that shaped him. And the third must be structural change, redefining what success looks like in policing, valuing justice and community trust above statistics and metrics. He looked around the room, his gaze touching on Jenkins, Bell, Williams, Taylor, and Matz before returning to the committee. I have spent my life in service to this country. I have led men and women into battle-made decisions that cost lives and saved them. Throughout that service, I have held to one fundamental belief: that the institutions we build reflect the values we hold. If we truly value equality and justice, then we must have the courage to reform the institutions that fall short of those ideals. As William concluded his testimony, the room erupted in applause, a spontaneous response quickly silenced by the chairman's gavel. But the impact of his words lingered, hanging in the air like a challenge and a promise. Outside the hearing room, media swarmed, cameras flashed, and questions flew. William moved through the chaos with quiet dignity, his allies beside him forming a protective formation, reminiscent of a military unit moving through hostile territory. They found a quiet anteroom where they could gather their thoughts before facing the press conference that would inevitably follow. You were magnificent, Sarah told her uncle, pride evident in her voice. William shook his head slightly. Not me. All of you. Your courage made this possible. Jenkins smiled, the first genuine smile William had seen from her. We followed your lead, General, just like your troops in Mosul. Bell nodded in agreement. I've spent 20 years in law enforcement, and today was the first time I truly felt like I was protecting and serving. Williams looked down at her now empty folder, all her evidence now part of the congressional record. What happens now? She asked, the question they were all thinking. William considered before responding. Now the real work begins. Testimony is important, but change requires sustained effort. The department will resist. Old habits don't die easily. But they do die, Matt said quietly, if enough people stand against them. A staff member appeared at the door. General Anderson. The press is waiting, and... He hesitated. Officer Hayes has just arrived. He's requesting to make a statement. William's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Is he indeed... Taylor tensed visibly. What's he playing at? "Let's find out," William replied, rising to his feet. Together, they moved as a unit toward the press conference area, united not by uniform or badge, but by shared purpose. As they entered the room, cameras swiveled to capture them. Reporters called out questions, and at the back of the crowd, Robert Hayes stood watching, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. The press conference room hummed with tension. Cameras flashed like tactical strobes, capturing the moment when William Anderson and his allies entered from one door as Robert Hayes approached from another. The two men, one in his dignified civilian suit with military bearing, the other in a pressed police uniform without badge or gun, locked eyes across the crowded space. Hayes had aged visibly in the weeks since Arlington. Deep lines had etched themselves around his mouth, and a haunted look shadowed his eyes. The confidence he had projected in his television interview had evaporated, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of defiance and dawning recognition. Congressman Davis stepped to the podium, raising his hands for silence. "Before we take questions, Officer Hayes has requested a moment to make a statement. In the interest of hearing all perspectives, the committee has granted this request." A murmur rippled through the assembled press. William remained impassive, his posture relaxed but alert as Hayes approached the podium. Sarah moved closer to her uncle's side, her expression wary. Hayes adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out over the sea of expectant faces. His gaze returned repeatedly to William, standing dignified and unmoved in the front row. "My name is Robert Hayes." He began, his voice rougher than in his television appearance. "I've been a police officer for 23 years. Last week at Arlington National Cemetery, I drew my weapon on General William Anderson while he was paying respects to a fallen comrade." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "In the days since, I've told myself and others that I was following protocol, that I was doing my job, that it wasn't about race." Hayes gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles whitening. "I've spent the last 7 hours watching this hearing, listening to testimony from my colleagues, reading documents I never knew existed or chose not to see. And I've realized something." The room had fallen completely silent, every ear straining to catch his words. "I didn't draw my weapon because General Anderson wasn't on my list. I drew it because when I saw an elderly black man in a general's uniform, my first thought wasn't veteran or mourner. It was imposter, threat, not belonging." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. William's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed slightly, assessing Hayes with the careful attention of a combat veteran, recognizing a potential shift in the field. "That reaction didn't come from nowhere." Hayes continued, his voice gaining strength. "It came from 23 years in a system that taught me, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, to see certain people as inherently suspicious. It came from training that rewarded proactive interventions in minority communities. It came from a culture that celebrated arrests over assistance." Hayes looked directly at William now. "What happened at Arlington wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was the inevitable result of a system functioning exactly as designed." The admission hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Cameras were capturing the moment from every angle. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Hayes said, his voice dropping. "What I did was inexcusable. I'm asking for something harder, for us to acknowledge that what happened wasn't just about me. It was about a system that shaped me, rewarded me, protected me when I acted on its unspoken assumptions." He straightened, squaring his shoulders. "I've submitted my resignation from the Metropolitan Police Department effective immediately, and I've provided the committee with a detailed account of every incident in my career where I now recognize bias affected my actions. It's 28 pages long." With that, Hayes stepped away from the podium. As he moved to leave the room, he paused briefly beside William. "General," he said quietly, for William's ears alone, "I can't undo what I did, but I can stop lying about why I did it." William regarded him steadily. "Recognition is the first step, Officer Hayes, not the last." Hayes nodded once, then continued toward the exit cameras, tracking his departure. Congressman Davis returned to the podium, visibly processing what had just occurred. "We'll now take questions from the press." The room erupted, reporters shouting over one another. Davis pointed to a woman in the front row. "General Anderson, what's your response to Officer Hayes' statement?" All eyes turned to William as he stepped forward. Officer Hayes showed courage today, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. But his individual recognition, while important, doesn't address the systemic issues that our testimony has revealed. One officer's admission doesn't change a culture. Another reporter raised his hand. Lieutenant Jenkins, do you believe Hayes' resignation is sufficient? Jenkins stepped forward, her bearing professional. This isn't about punishing one officer. It's about reforming a system. Hayes' resignation is a personal reckoning, not an institutional one. Mr. Matchun called another reporter. As the former Deputy Director of Internal Affairs, do you believe the department can reform itself from within? Matz considered the question carefully. No institution reforms without external pressure. Change requires both internal champions and external accountability. What I witnessed in today's hearing gives me cautious hope that both elements may finally be present. The questions continued probing, challenging, sometimes skeptical. William and his allies answered with a unity of purpose that transcended their different backgrounds and perspectives. They spoke not of retribution, but of reform, not of punishment, but of progress, not of individuals, but of institutions. As the press conference concluded, Congressman Davis made a final statement. Based on today's testimony, this committee will issue preliminary recommendations within 30 days. These will address department training, complaint processes, accountability measures, and community oversight. This hearing is not the end of our investigation, but the beginning of a necessary process of examination and reform. Outside the Rayburn building, the October afternoon had turned golden autumn light, gilding the Capitol dome in the distance. William stood on the steps with his allies, a moment of shared recognition passing between them. Phase 1 complete, Jenkins said quietly. William nodded. And Phase 2 begins immediately. The department will push back. Resistance to change is as predictable as sunrise. We'll be ready, Williams assured him. We've been preparing for this longer than they know. As if to confirm her prediction, Williams' phone buzzed with an incoming text from a journalist contact. Police union just released statement challenging the one-sided narrative of today's hearing, claiming rush to judgment and political theater. The counterattack has begun. Williams showed the message to the others without comment. Bell's expression hardened. They'll try to discredit each of us individually, pick apart our testimonies, find inconsistencies real or imagined. Let them try, Sarah said, her voice steady with conviction. The truth doesn't become less true under scrutiny. William placed a hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. Well said. He looked at each of his allies in turn. This is where the real test begins, not in front of cameras or committees, but in the daily work of change. Are you prepared for that? One by one, they nodded, Jenkins with professional resolve, Bell with quiet determination, Williams with fierce commitment, Taylor with youthful conviction, Matz with solemn purpose. Then we continue, William concluded, together. The leaked email became the centerpiece of public discourse over the following days. News programs displayed it on screen, analysts dissected its implications, social media amplified its impact. The explicit instruction, if you're uncertain, verify. If it's a white civilian, ask. If it's a person of color, detain. It's safer for you that way. Could not be dismissed as misinterpretation or isolated prejudice. It was policy captured in black and white. In Williams' living room, now serving as an unofficial command center, strategies were developed and refined. Jenkins coordinated with officers still within the department who had been emboldened by the hearing to come forward. Bell worked with community organizations to document ongoing incidents. Williams organized the growing archive of evidence. Taylor, using his internal affairs training, analyzed patterns and policies. Matz provided institutional knowledge explaining how the system worked and how it could be changed. Sarah moved between these efforts, bringing her perspective as both family member and civilian observer. And William, drawing on decades of military leadership, helped shape their disparate talents into a cohesive campaign. 3 days after the hearing, as they reviewed the police union's latest statement defending departmental practices, William's phone rang. The screen showed Eleanor Matthews' name. Eleanor, William greeted her. How are you? I'm calling about the package, she replied, her voice tight with urgency. The one James left for you. Did you open the false bottom of the journal? William frowned, glancing at Matthew's journal on his desk. False bottom. In the back cover, James said you'd find it when you were ready, but I think you need it now. After ending the call, William retrieved the journal. He examined the back cover, carefully running his fingers along the edges until he felt a slight irregularity. Pressing gently, he heard a small click as a hidden compartment released. Inside lay a USB drive and a handwritten note in Matthew's precise script. Will, if you're reading this, two things have happened. I've completed my final deployment, and you found yourself in the battle we always knew was coming. This drive contains what the lawyers call insurance evidence I've collected over the years about systemic issues in law enforcement, military and government agencies. James P.S. Remember Mosul. Sometimes the best defense is an unexpected offense. William plugged the drive into his laptop. It contained hundreds of files, internal memos, training documents, statistical analyses, body camera footage, personnel records meticulously organized and annotated. Matthews, even while battling cancer, had been building a case, gathering evidence of systemic discrimination across multiple institutions. William called the others to his study. As they reviewed the contents, the scope of Matthews' work became clear. He had created a comprehensive map of how bias was institutionalized, protected, and perpetuated. This is incredible, Williams murmured, scrolling through a spreadsheet tracking racial disparities in police interventions. He cross-referenced everything, built statistical models, created timelines. James always was thorough, William said quietly, a sad smile touching his lips. In Mosul, he could plan an operation down to the second. Jenkins looked up from the screen. This changes everything. With this level of documentation, they can't dismiss our claims as anecdotal or isolated. There's something else, Taylor noted, opening a folder labeled Internal Communications. He has emails from department leadership explicitly discussing how to manage public perception of racial incidents. They knew exactly what was happening. Williams studied a particular document, a memo from the police commissioner to district commanders, following a controversial shooting 3 years earlier. While we must acknowledge community concerns, our primary message should emphasize officer safety and procedural adherence. The racial element, while unavoidable in media coverage, should not be our focus. Statistics on crime rates by demographic can be made available to friendly outlets if pressure increases. They were deliberately deflecting from the racial component. Bell said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Creating a parallel narrative to protect the system? Matz nodded grimly. That was standard practice. I wrote similar memos myself. William leaned back in his chair thinking. James didn't just leave us evidence, he said finally. He left us a strategy. Look at how he organized this, by institution, by pattern, by impact. He wasn't just documenting problems. He was mapping vulnerabilities in the system. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, moved closer. What are you thinking, Uncle Will? William's expression was thoughtful, the look his officers had learned to recognize before a tactical shift. I'm thinking that we've been playing defense, responding to the department's narrative, challenging their claims. Perhaps it's time, as James suggested, for an unexpected offense. Turn. The next morning, William called a strategy meeting. When everyone had assembled, he outlined his approach. Until now, we've focused on exposing what happened at Arlington and the pattern it represents. But Matthew's evidence gives us a broader perspective. William spread several documents on the table. This isn't just about Hayes or even the Metropolitan Police Department. It's about a systemic approach to law enforcement that prioritizes control over community statistics over service. Jenkins nodded slowly. So instead of fighting individual battles, we target the system itself, William confirmed. Not just the symptoms, but the disease. Bell leaned forward. How exactly? William laid out a three-pronged strategy. First, they would publish key findings from Matthew's evidence, coordinating with trusted journalists to ensure accurate reporting. Second, they would engage directly with community organizations already working on police reform, sharing resources and building coalitions. Third, and most importantly, they would develop specific policy recommendations for implementation at local, state, and federal levels. This isn't about punishment, William emphasized. It's about transformation, not just removing bad practices, but instituting good ones. As they divided responsibilities and set timelines, William observed the change in his allies. The initial righteous anger had matured into something more focused and sustainable, a commitment to structural change rather than personal vindication. That evening, as the others departed with their assignments, Sarah remained behind, helping William organize the materials they had reviewed. "You're not just fighting for justice anymore," she observed. "You're building something." William nodded, considering her insight. "In combat, I learned that destroying an enemy position is meaningless if you can't hold the ground afterward. The same principle applies here. Exposing the system's flaws creates an opportunity, but only rebuilding creates lasting change." Sarah studied her uncle's face, the lines of experience, the steady gaze that had seen both battlefield horrors and bureaucratic evasions. "James knew exactly what he was doing when he left you. That evidence, didn't he?" "Yes," William agreed quietly. "He knew I would need more than righteous anger to see this through. He gave me a map." Sarah smiled sadly. "He knew his general." William's hand rested briefly on Matthew's journal. "That he did." The department's resistance began almost immediately after the hearing. The police commissioner issued a statement acknowledging areas for improvement while defending the dedicated men and women who serve our communities daily. The police union was less diplomatic, questioning the motivations of the witnesses and suggesting political agendas were driving the investigation. More concerning were the personal attacks. Jenkins found herself subject to an internal investigation for improper disclosure of confidential information. Bell received anonymous threats. Williams's personnel file was leaked to a conservative blog, which scrutinized her career for any hint of impropriety. Taylor was formally reprimanded for his intervention at Arlington. William, protected somewhat by his military status and public profile, became the target of more subtle, undermining commentary, questioning whether a military commander truly understood civilian policing suggestions, that his age might have affected his perception of events at Arlington, implications that he was being manipulated by anti-police activists. Through it all, William maintained the same steady composure that had carried him through combat zones. "They're following the standard playbook," he told his increasingly frustrated allies. "Discredit the messengers to avoid addressing the message." A month after the hearing, as autumn deepened toward winter, the Congressional Committee released its preliminary findings. The report was more forceful than many had anticipated, identifying systematic patterns of bias and institutional failures of oversight. It recommended substantial reforms, including independent review of complaints, mandatory body cameras with civilian access to footage, revised training protocols, and community involvement in officer evaluation. The department leadership publicly accepted the recommendations while privately working to delay and dilute their implementation. Progress came in incremental steps: policy revisions, training adjustments, procedural changes, each one fought for and won through persistent pressure and irrefutable evidence. For William and his allies, the campaign became a daily exercise in strategic patience. They documented compliance and non-compliance, celebrated small victories, and maintained focus on the larger goal of systematic reform. "It's like pushing a boulder uphill," Jenkins commented one evening, reviewing the latest departmental response to a proposed oversight mechanism. "Every inch of progress requires maximum effort." William nodded, understanding her frustration. "In Iraq, we had a saying, 'The desert teaches patience.' This is no different. Change of this magnitude doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in persistent effort, day after day." Bell, who had been studying a new training protocol, looked up. "But is it making a difference, really? Or are we just creating more paperwork while the same behaviors continue?" It was a question they all felt, at times the doubt that institutional inertia could truly be overcome, that policies on paper would translate to practices on the street. William considered before responding. "When I took command in Mosul, we faced an entrenched insurgency that had been operating for years. Our first efforts seemed futile. Every patrol, every operation met with resistance or indifference. It wasn't until the local population began to see consistent change that momentum shifted." He looked around at his allies. "We're still in the early stages. The real measure will come when officers on patrol and citizens on the street experience policing differently." As if in answer to his reflection, William's phone rang. The caller ID showed Officer Taylor's number. "General Anderson," William answered. "What news?" Taylor's voice came through animated with unusual excitement. Sir, you need to see this. The department just released the new training guidelines and they've actually implemented the changes we proposed. Not watered down, not reinterpreted, the actual language we submitted. William put the phone on speaker so the others could hear. Section 3 specifically addresses bias and threat assessment, Taylor continued. It mandates that officers consider multiple factors beyond appearance or demographic characteristics. And the most important part, it requires documentation and justification of any stop or detention with regular pattern analysis to identify potential bias. Jenkins leaned toward the phone. Who signed off on this? That's the other news, Taylor replied. Captain Richardson, you know from the 5th District, he's been appointed to head the new Office of Professional Standards. Word is he specifically requested the assignment after watching the hearing. After the call ended, a cautious optimism filled the room. Richardson was known as a straight shooter, an officer with a reputation for fairness and integrity. His appointment suggested that at least some within the department were committed to genuine reform. It's a start, William acknowledged, tempering their excitement with realistic assessment. One policy change, one supportive captain, but it's more than we had yesterday. Sarah, who had been listening, quietly spoke up. It's like you said, Uncle Will, consistent change shifts momentum. Maybe that's beginning to happen. William nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps, but the real test will come in implementation, not announcement. That test came sooner than expected. 3 weeks later, a situation unfolded that would measure the impact of their efforts in real terms. William was reviewing documentation with Williams when Jenkins called, her voice tight with urgency. Turn on the news, Channel 7, now. Williams switched on the television to see live helicopter footage of a confrontation outside a community center in southeast Washington. Police vehicles surrounded the building officers, with weapons drawn positioned behind them. A crowd had gathered at the perimeter, many recording with cell phones. The news anchor's voice provided context. Police responded to reports of a man with a gun outside the Anacostia Community Center. Witnesses say the individual, identified as local resident Marcus Johnson, was actually carrying a camera tripod for a youth media program he runs at the center. The situation has been ongoing for approximately 20 minutes. Out home, William watched intently, noting the tactical positioning, the growing crowd, the potential for escalation. This was precisely the type of situation where bias could lead to tragedy. A black man misidentified as armed police, responding with overwhelming force, community tensions rising with each passing minute. I know that center, Bell said, having arrived moments after Jenkins' call. It's 2 blocks from where I grew up. Those kids in the media program, they're doing good work documenting community issues, creating their own narratives. Williams joined them, her expression grim. This is the moment of truth. All the policies, all the training, do they make a difference when officers are in the field, adrenaline pumping, facing what they perceive as a threat? They watched as a police supervisor arrived on scene, immediately establishing a perimeter and ordering officers to lower their weapons. The camera zoomed in as he approached the center of the confrontation, hands visible, posture non-threatening. That's Richardson, Jenkins identified, leaning forward. The new head of professional standards. Richardson spoke with the officers already on scene, then approached Johnson, who stood frozen, the tripod still in his hands. Their conversation wasn't audible, but the body language was clear. Richardson listening, nodding, maintaining a respectful distance. After a brief exchange, Richardson turned to the assembled officers and made a gesture. Weapons were holstered. The perimeter relaxed. Johnson set down the tripod and showed Richardson something on his phone, presumably evidence of his role at the community center. The news anchor's voice returned. It appears the situation is being resolved peacefully. Captain Richardson, recently appointed to lead the department's new Office of Professional Standards, has de-escalated what witnesses described as an increasingly tense confrontation. William watched as Richardson and Johnson shook hands. Officers began dispersing the crowd with notably different body language than when they had arrived, less confrontational, more communicative. The entire encounter had transformed from potential tragedy to peaceful resolution in a matter of minutes. That, Williams said quietly, is what change looks like. Bell nodded slowly, emotion evident in his eyes. I've seen that same scenario play out 100 times, And it rarely ended this way. Not in that neighborhood. One incident doesn't mean systemic change, Jenkins cautioned, ever the pragmatist. No, William agreed, but it's evidence that change is possible, that with the right leadership, the right training, the right accountability, different outcomes become achievable. William studied the screen thoughtfully. Richardson is implementing what we've been advocating. And it worked. The news program cut to an on-scene reporter interviewing community members. One older woman spoke with passionate clarity. We saw something different today. Those officers came in ready for war, but that captain changed the whole situation. He listened. He treated Marcus like a human being, not a threat. That's all we've ever asked for. William turned down the volume, a thoughtful expression on his face. This is how momentum builds. One incident witnessed and documented becomes evidence that alternative approaches work, not just in theory, but in practice. Sarah, who had been silent during the broadcast, touched William's arm. Uncle Will, look at the crowd. William focused on the background of the shot where community members were still gathered, many recording with phones. Among them, he spotted a familiar face, Officer Taylor in civilian clothes, quietly observing. He's documenting, William realized, making sure there's a record regardless of how it played out. They're all documenting, Sarah pointed out. Every person with a phone is creating accountability. William nodded, understanding the significance. The system functions differently when it knows it's being watched. That awareness creates space for those within it who want to do better. Later that evening, William received a text from Taylor. Richardson implemented the new protocols exactly. Ordered weapons lowered, established communication, verified facts before acting, documented everything. This is what we've been working for. William showed the message to the others who had remained to process what they had witnessed. It's one incident, Jenkins repeated, but her voice held less skepticism than before. It's a beginning, William corrected gently, and beginnings matter. The weeks that followed brought both progress and setbacks. Some officers embraced the new protocols, finding that de-escalation and communication not only reduced tension, but actually made their jobs safer and more effective. Others resisted, clinging to old habits and assumptions. Department leadership, recognizing the shifting public sentiment, became more cooperative with the reform efforts. The police union remained skeptical, but found its reflexive opposition increasingly out of step with members who saw benefits in the new approaches. For William and his allies, the work continued, monitoring implementation, documenting outcomes, advocating for further reforms. Their coalition expanded, bringing in community organizations, legal experts, and progressive officers committed to change. 2 months after the hearing, as winter settled over Washington, the Congressional Committee released its final report. The document was comprehensive and unflinching, identifying systemic issues while acknowledging the complexity of police reform. Most importantly, it established concrete metrics for measuring progress and mechanisms for ongoing oversight. The day after the report's release, William received an unexpected visitor. Captain Richardson, in uniform but alone, arrived at his home without prior notice. General Anderson Arashkina. Richardson greeted him formally. I apologize for coming unannounced, but I wanted to speak with you directly. William invited him in, curious about the purpose of his visit. In the living room, Richardson declined the offered seat, remaining standing, as if delivering an official report. I want you to know, Richardson began, that what you started with your testimony has created space for change within the department. Those of us who have wanted to do things differently now have the authority and backing to implement new approaches. William nodded, acknowledging the statement. The Anacostia incident demonstrated that clearly. Your handling of that situation prevented what could have been a tragedy. Richardson's expression was solemn. I was in Iraq too, you know. Different unit, different time, but the same lessons. Clear objectives, proportional response. Understand the environment before engaging. He paused. Somehow those principles got lost when we brought them home and applied them to our own communities. Not lost, William corrected gently. Distorted. Applied selectively based on who was being policed. Richardson nodded, accepting the assessment. Yes, that's accurate. He straightened, returning to his purpose. I've been authorized to establish a community advisory board for the Office of Professional Standards. I'd like to ask Lieutenant Jenkins and Sergeant Bell to serve as liaisons. Their perspective would be invaluable. William studied the captain thoughtfully. That's their decision to make, of course. But may I ask why you're approaching me rather than them directly? Richardson smiled slightly. Because they trust you, General. And because I wanted you to know that what happened at Arlington, as terrible as it was, has created an opportunity that some of us have been waiting for a long time. After Richardson left, William contacted Jenkins and Bell to relay the invitation. Their responses reflected the cautious optimism that had begun to characterize their efforts. Recognition of progress tempered by awareness of how much remained to be done. It's a meaningful step, Jenkins acknowledged. Having direct input into standards and training could accelerate change from within. Bell was more reserved. It's either a genuine opportunity or a way to manage our criticism by bringing us inside. Either way, I think we should accept. If it's real, we can make a difference. If it's not, we'll know sooner rather than later. William agreed with both assessments. The important thing is that you'll be in the room where decisions are made, not as tokens, but as experienced officers with valuable perspective. That evening, Sarah found William in his study, reviewing Matthew's journal by the soft light of his desk lamp. "You look contemplative, Uncle Will," she observed, taking the chair across from him. William closed the journal gently. "I was thinking about something James wrote after a particularly difficult operation in Mosul. We had cleared a neighborhood house by house, only to have insurgents return as soon as we moved on. He noted that military victory is meaningless without winning the trust of the community." Sarah nodded, understanding the parallel. "And that's what's happening now with the police reforms." "Exactly. Policy changes create the opportunity, but lasting transformation requires rebuilding trust. That's a much longer process." Sarah studied her uncle's face, the lines of experience, the quiet dignity, the unwavering resolve that had carried him through combat and now through this different kind of battle. "Are you satisfied with what's been accomplished?" she asked. William considered the question carefully. Satisfied? No. What happened at Arlington revealed deep fractures in systems that are supposed to protect all citizens equally. Those fractures won't be healed by a few months of focused attention. He paused, his expression thoughtful. "But I am encouraged. Real change has begun. Whether it continues and deepens will depend on sustained effort by many people long after the headlines have faded. Including you," Sarah pressed gently. William smiled slightly. "Including me. This is not a battle I can walk away from, Sarah. Not while I have the strength to fight it." 3 months after the Arlington incident, William returned to the cemetery. The winter morning was clear and cold, frost gilding the endless rows of white headstones. He walked alone this time, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. Matthew's grave had received its permanent marker, simple, dignified, listing his rank, service, and decorations. William stood before it, head bowed in quiet reflection. "We're making progress, old friend," he said softly. "Not as quickly as either of us would like, but progress nonetheless." He placed a small stone on top of the marker, an old military tradition, a sign that someone had visited, that the fallen were not forgotten. As William turned to leave, he noticed a figure waiting respectfully at a distance, Karen Williams, her expression solemn in the winter light. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said as he approached. "I wanted to pay my respects as well, and I thought I might find you here today." William nodded in understanding. "Not intruding at all. James would appreciate the company." They walked together through the frost-covered grounds, their conversation touching on recent developments, the implementation of new training protocols, the establishment of the Community Advisory Board, the ongoing resistance from those invested in the old system. "It's strange," Williams reflected. "For years I kept those emails and documents waiting for the right moment to reveal them. I imagined dramatic exposés, public outrage, immediate change." She shook her head slightly. "The reality is so much more incremental. Small victories, gradual shifts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how real change happens," William replied. "Not in grand gestures, but in persistent effort. The question is whether we have the stamina to see it through." William smiled, a determined light in her eyes. "I think we've proven that we do, General." As they neared the cemetery gates, Williams hesitated. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." That day at Arlington when Hayes drew his weapon, you didn't seem surprised. Angry, yes, but not surprised. Why is that? William was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. Because I've lived long enough to recognize the pattern, he finally said. What happened that day wasn't an aberration. It was the system functioning as designed, identifying threats based on appearance, rather than behavior escalating, rather than communicating, assuming the worst rather than verifying. He met William's eyes directly. I wasn't surprised by what happened. I was surprised by what followed, that people actually paid attention this time, that the moment created an opportunity for change. Williams nodded slowly. Because of who you are, your rank, your decorations, your service. Partly, William acknowledged, but also because the time was right, because enough people had witnessed enough similar incidents to recognize the pattern, because the ground had been prepared by years of documentation and advocacy by people like you, Jenkins Bell, countless others who kept records, filed reports, raised concerns, even when no one seemed to be listening. They had reached the gates. Beyond them, the city stretched into the distance, a complex tapestry of communities and institutions, challenges and possibilities. The work continues, Williams said, not as a burden but as a commitment. Williams nodded in agreement. It does, and we continue with it. The final hearing of the Congressional Oversight Committee took place 6 months after the Arlington incident. William testified again along with Jenkins, Bell, Williams, and Taylor. This time they reported on progress made, challenges remaining, and recommendations for sustaining momentum. Williams' testimony was measured and specific, acknowledging improvements, while emphasizing the need for continued vigilance. He spoke not as an accuser, but as a citizen invested in the integrity of public institutions. The systems we build reflect the values we hold, he told the committee. If we truly value equal justice, equal protection, and equal dignity for all citizens, then we must continue the work of aligning our institutions with those values. Not just in policy, but in practice. Not just in rhetoric, but in reality. After the hearing, as William and his allies gathered outside the committee room, Congressman Davis approached them. General Anderson, he said, extending his hand, your continued involvement has been invaluable. The committee is recommending that these reforms be used as a model for departments nationwide. William accepted the handshake. That's encouraging news, Congressman. But the real measure will be sustainability, whether these changes endure beyond the current attention. Davis nodded in agreement, which is why we're establishing a permanent oversight mechanism with both governmental and community representation. He glanced at the group surrounding William. We'd like all of you to consider serving in an advisory capacity. As they discussed the details, William observed the subtle but significant shifts in his allies since their first meeting 6 months earlier. Jenkins carried herself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was finally being recognized. Bell spoke with the authority of an officer committed to reform rather than the caution of one fearing retribution. Williams approached her role not as a whistleblower, but as an architect of new systems. Taylor had matured from idealistic rookie to pragmatic advocate, and Sarah, who had initially joined this battle out of family loyalty, now brought her own perspective as a civilian bridge between law enforcement and community concerns. They had become more than allies, they were a coalition, each bringing unique strengths to a shared purpose. Later that day, they gathered at Williams' home to reflect on the journey thus far and plan next steps. The atmosphere was different from their early meetings, less urgent crisis management, more sustained strategic thinking. We've accomplished more than I thought possible 6 months ago, Jenkins acknowledged. New training protocols, civilian oversight, accountability mechanisms, community engagement requirements. But implementation remains inconsistent, Bell pointed out. Some districts embrace the changes, others resist passively through selective enforcement. Williams nodded in agreement. The culture shifts more slowly than the policies. That's always the challenge. Which is why our work continues, Williams said. Not as a sprint, but as a marathon. Not as a single battle, but as a sustained campaign. Taylor, who had been quiet, spoke up. I spoke with Richardson yesterday. He's tracking officer compliance with the new protocols. The data shows improvement, fewer unnecessary escalations, more successful de-escalations, better outcomes across demographic groups. Data matters, Williams agreed. It gives us objective measures beyond anecdotes and impressions. As their discussion continued, William stepped briefly into his study. On his desk lay Matthew's journal, beside it, the most recent departmental report showing implementation of reforms. The contrast struck him, the personal record of one soldier's observations, alongside the institutional documentation of systemic change. Sarah joined him, noting his thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking, Uncle Will?" William touched the journal gently. "I'm thinking about James, about what he would make of all this." Sarah smiled softly. "I think he'd be proud, not just of what has been accomplished, but of how you've approached it with dignity, with purpose, with unwavering commitment to the values you both served." William nodded, accepting her assessment. He understood something fundamental that many forget, that our uniforms, our badges, our ranks are not ends in themselves, but symbols of service to higher principles. When we forget that, we betray not just those we serve, but ourselves. They returned to the living room, where the discussion had turned to next steps, expanding their coalition, developing training materials based on successful approaches, engaging with departments in other jurisdictions interested in similar reforms. "This is how change becomes permanent," William observed, "when it moves beyond the original catalyst to become a self-sustaining movement." As evening approached and their allies prepared to leave, each with specific assignments and timelines, Bell raised a question that had lingered unspoken. "What about Hayes?" he asked. "Has anyone heard what happened to him after his resignation?" There was a brief silence. Hayes had disappeared from public view after his statement at the press conference, his name rarely mentioned in subsequent discussions of reform. "I heard he's working with a police psychology researcher," Taylor offered, "studying how bias affects threat assessment and decision-making under stress." William nodded, unsurprised. "Using his experience to help others understand the patterns. That's appropriate." "Do you forgive him?" Bell asked directly, his gaze steady on William. William considered the question, carefully aware that his answer mattered to everyone in the room. "Forgiveness is a personal choice," he finally said, "but being present so that justice isn't buried with those who have fallen, that's a responsibility." He looked around at the circle of allies who had become something more. A coalition, a force for change, perhaps even friends. "Hayes is addressing the consequences of his actions in his own way. Our responsibility is to ensure that the system that shaped him is transformed so that others don't make the same choices he did." As they departed one by one, each acknowledged William in their own way, Jenkins with a formal handshake, Bell with a respectful nod, Williams with a brief embrace, Taylor with youthful enthusiasm. The coalition that had formed in crisis had evolved into a network committed to sustained reform. When only Sarah remained, she found William standing at the window, watching the winter evening settle over Alexandria. "Are you okay, Uncle Will?" she asked, joining him. William's expression was contemplative but peaceful. "Yes," he replied. "I was just thinking about something James wrote in his journal. After a particularly difficult operation, when it seemed like all our efforts had been in vain, he noted, Anderson reminded us today that we don't fight because victory is certain. We fight because the cause is just." Sarah leaned against her uncle's shoulder. "Wise words." "Indeed," William agreed, "and applicable beyond the battlefield." Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, transforming the familiar landscape. William watched the gentle descent of flakes, each one unique, each one part of a pattern that would over time change everything it touched. "So what now?" Sarah asked softly. William's expression remained steady, resolute, unwavering in his commitment to the principles that had guided his life. "Now," he said, "we continue the work, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Not because it will be completed quickly, but because it must be sustained faithfully. Not because we will see all the changes we seek, but because those who come after us deserve to inherit better systems than we did." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Not just policy changes, but cultural transformation." "Exactly," William confirmed. "The kind of change that occurs not in dramatic moments, but in daily choices, consistent actions, persistent effort." He smiled slightly. "The kind of change that endures." As the snow continued to fall, William Anderson stood at the window of his Alexandria home, the weight of past battles balanced by the purpose of present ones. The Arlington confrontation had been a catalyst, revealing fractures in systems long overdue for reform. But the true measure of its impact would be not in the moment itself, but in the sustained effort that followed the daily unglamorous work of transforming institutions to reflect the highest ideals of the nation they served. For William, that work was not a burden, but a final mission, perhaps the most important of his long career of service. Not on foreign soil, but here at home. Not with weapons, but with words, evidence, and unwavering commitment to truth. Outside his window, the world continued to change. Snowflake by snowflake, choice by choice, action by action. And William Anderson, General, United States Army, retired, stood ready to continue the battle not with anger, but with purpose, not seeking victory, but transformation. Not demanding recognition, but insisting on justice. Unwavering in his honor, as he had always been. A week later, William sat alone in Charleston Park, the winter sun casting long shadows across the empty benches. On his lap rested his old service cap, its insignia catching occasional glints of sunlight. In his hand, he held a letter from Matthew's wife, Eleanor. William James always believed you would come not to prove anything, but to keep your promise. In these difficult months since his passing, I found comfort in knowing that his faith in you was so completely justified. The changes you've helped create will outlive all of us. There is no greater legacy. With gratitude, Eleanor William folded the letter carefully and placed it in Matthew's field journal, which he carried with him now as a reminder of purpose and perspective. He did not weep. He simply sat back straight, gazed steady presence, unwavering. Across the park, a young black man walked with his son, perhaps 10 years old. The man hesitated upon seeing William, recognition dawning in his eyes. He whispered something to his son, and together they approached. "General Anderson," the man said respectfully. William looked up, nodding in acknowledgement. "I just wanted to thank you, sir. My brother is a police officer in the 7th District. He says the new protocols you helped implement have changed everything: how they approach situations, how they interact with the community, how they measure success." William smiled slightly. "I'm glad to hear that, but the credit belongs to many people working together." The man nodded, then nudged his son gently. The boy stepped forward, solemn and earnest. "Sir, we learned about you in school. Our teacher showed us the video from Arlington. She said you showed dignity under pressure." William studied the boy thoughtfully. "What's your name, young man?" "Marcus, sir." "Well, Marcus, remember, this dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you maintain regardless of how others treat you." "Huh," the boy nodded, absorbing the lesson. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "We won't take more of your time, General. I just wanted you to know that what you started is making a difference. Real difference on the streets every day." As they turned to go, the father paused, not taking a photo or asking for an autograph, but simply bowing his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. William watched them walk away, the father and son talking animatedly, their figures silhouetted against the winter sun. Around them, other park visitors moved through their day, some glancing at William with recognition, others passing by unaware of his significance. Sarah's final question echoed in his mind. "So you don't forgive him?" His answer remained the same. "No. Forgiveness is a choice. But being present so justice isn't buried with those who fall, that's a responsibility." William placed his service cap back on his head, rising slowly from the bench. At 67, his body carried the scars and memories of battles fought across decades and continents. But his bearing remained straight, his gaze steady, his purpose clear. As he walked through the park, people noticed him, not just for the medals on his jacket or the military bearing of his posture, but for the quiet dignity of his presence. Some nodded in recognition. Others simply watched him pass. A few parents pointed him out to their children, speaking in hushed tones about service and courage. William acknowledged them with simple nods, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. He was not a symbol or a spokesman, but a citizen who had stood his ground when principles demanded it. The afternoon light lengthened into evening. William made his way home through streets transformed by winter, each step measured and purposeful. The battle that had begun at Arlington would continue not in dramatic confrontations, but in daily choices, consistent actions, unwavering commitment to change. Justice had not triumphed completely, but this time it had not been buried. It had been witnessed. And in that witnessing, transformation had begun. For William Anderson, that was enough to continue the march forward one step at a time with unwavering honor. I've completed Part 3, 6,000 Words of Unwavering Honor, bringing the story to its conclusion. This section follows your outline closely while maintaining the cinematic writing style, emotional depth, and carefully paced narrative.